So, welcome everybody. I'm now going to explain how we as a teaching programme on the MSc Speech and Language Sciences developed some guidelines for giving students feedback on their assessed work. And to give you some relevant context, I'm going to tell you a bit about the MSc Speech and Language Sciences programme. It's a 2-year intensive full-time programme, and at the end of the programme, if students are successful, they are recommended to the Health and Care Professions Council to practice as a speech and language therapist. So the students coming on our course wish to qualify as a speech and language therapist as well as gaining a UCL master's degree. And to be an effective speech and language therapist, they have to be good at receiving feedback and good at giving feedback, giving effective feedback to their clients, to significant others of clients, and to their colleagues and to anyone that they're supervising. So we do train our students in both receiving feedback and giving feedback. And so we think it's important as a teaching staff to do right by them and give them good feedback when we mark their coursework. So what I'm going to do is describe to you how we develop these guidelines, and hopefully you will take something out of this that you can adapt to your programs. So the first thing that we did was to collect views from students on what they felt constituted good feedback. And we did this in 2 ways. First of all, we had focus groups with the students, and we were helped by our colleagues in ARENA. And it was good because the teaching staff didn't run those focus groups, and the students who participated were anonymised so that they felt freer to say whatever they liked about the feedback. And we also collected some feedback from them on anonymous questionnaires. So I took all that information as the programme director. I also looked at some literature, and I looked through comments that Marcus had made on different modules, on different assessments on different modules, and I made a list, not a very long list, say 1 side of A4, of comments. Then I suggested to our teaching staff that they might like to look at this list and use it as a basis for discussion on principles of giving good feedback. So then I took that information and I also looked at some of the resources that are on the UCL Teaching and Learning portal, and we came up with a draft set of guidelines that we discussed at a teaching committee meeting. And then we formed the latest set of guidelines, both for staff and for students. So one thing that students told us is that they really didn't like too much feedback. They found it overwhelming. And also that even if their work was really bad, they would like to have some positive feedback. So we began like this, and we decided as a staff that we would identify a few key strengths in the work and then a few areas for improvement. And that one way to cut down on marking and markers' time is to just highlight some of those patterns. So having identified some areas for improvement, we would just give them 1 or 2 examples of that and not pick up every example. So here are some examples of that. So in other words, they might make many referencing errors, but we wouldn't highlight or comment or correct them all. We would just correct a few and make a comment like this. Here's another example. Another thing that students told us is that they wanted us to be specific not just about areas for improvement, but also in the positive comments. And I think in the past, what we had done is reserve the specificity for the areas for improvement and not for the positive comments. Here's an example, and here's another example. We tried to make sure that we give balanced feedback and that generally the tone is positive, even if we're suggesting an area of improvement. So here are some examples that we felt fell into that category. And here's another one. I think we'd all agree that rewriting or giving answers to the students is not an effective way to encourage them to learn, but rather to give them ideas on what they can actually do to improve. Even though some students want the former, I think that the literature and our experience tells us that the latter is more effective. So here's an example of that. So something that we learned from the literature, something that chimed with us as well, is that it's useful if you can give feedback that students can turn into a mental checklist to use for other work. So here's an example of that. In other words, in future pieces of work, students can be thinking, I need to describe my clinical decision, and then I need to provide the rationale. Here's the next clinical decision, and I must then provide the rationale. So that's an example of a checklist that the student can have for other work. And some of the markers had given really nice examples of this, so we decided to include it with this example. So it's important for for students to realise not just how the feedback can help them with the next piece of work, but how it can also help them in their jobs and in their profession. And this is based on the most common complaint from students, both on our programme and I gather in our faculty as well. And that is students saying we're always telling them what they should be adding to the work, but we're not suggesting what could be summarised further or what could be omitted. And we all felt very sympathetic with that, because we know that when we get comments back from reviewers after submitting drafts of papers, we also get frustrated when the word limit is so restricted. So here are 2 examples of that. So lastly, as I said, what we did then is get together as a staff and decide which of these principles we were going to communicate to the students. That was really important. So we decided on these 3. So they would know that we weren't going to be giving feedback on everything, but rather we would just be picking out a few areas of strength and a few areas for improvement, and that we wouldn't be highlighting and correcting all the examples, but just 1 or 2 of each. And we promised them that we would definitely do that. So that's it from me, and thank you for listening.